Hello, hello. Welcome to the urinary system. In lesson 1, we will look at the organs of the urinary system and spend some time looking at the gross anatomy of the kidneys. Here's a brief overview of an introduction to the urinary or renal system. The organs of this system are a few. There are 2 kidneys, from which extend 2 ureters, the urinary bladder, and the urethra. The kidneys contribute to homeostasis by filtering and adjusting the composition of blood. In doing so, wastes are collected as urine, which leaves the kidneys via the ureters to be stored in the urinary bladder. When it is time, urine is excreted from the body via the urethra. Nephrology is the scientific study of the anatomy, physiology, and pathophysiology or disease of the kidneys. The branch of medicine that deals with the function of the system itself is urology, which is also the study of the male reproductive system, as you recall. The kidneys are the main organs of the urinary system and play several roles, as you can see from this overview. Many of them are related to maintaining the normal parameters for blood. The kidneys regulate blood ion concentration by keeping normal levels of several ions, including sodium, potassium, calcium, chloride, and phosphate. The kidneys also regulate blood pH by excreting variable amounts of hydrogen ion into the urine, the waste product from the kidneys, or by conserving bicarbonate ions, which are important buffers in the blood. The kidneys regulate blood volume by adjusting the amount of water that is either conserved or eliminated in urine. The kidneys regulate blood pressure by regulating blood volume, but also through the secretion of the enzyme renin, which activates the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone pathway. We will be exploring that one later. The kidneys maintain normal blood osmolarity close to 300 milliosmoles per liter. Osmolarity of a solution is a measure of the total number of dissolved particles per liter of solution and reflects the solution's ability to create osmosis. So besides regulating the composition of blood and volume, the kidneys also produce 2 hormones. Calcitriol is the active form of vitamin D, which maintains calcium homeostasis, and erythropoietin is the other hormone. This is the one that stimulates red blood cell production. Interestingly, the kidneys also regulate blood glucose levels. Like the liver, the kidneys can use certain amino acids for gluconeogenesis and thereby release glucose into the blood to help maintain normal blood glucose levels. Finally, the kidneys excrete wastes and foreign substances in the urine. Wastes are substances that have no useful function in the body, including excess of ions as well as products of metabolism, such as ammonia and urea from deamination of amino acids, metabolites of bilirubin from the breakdown of red blood cells, creatinine from the breakdown of creatine phosphate in muscle fibers, and uric acid from the catabolism of nucleic acids. The urine also contains foreign substances such as drugs and environmental toxins. Let's meet the kidneys. The kidneys are reddish, bean-shaped organs located just above the waist between the level of the last thoracic and third lumbar vertebrae. This affords them partial protection by the 11th and 12th pair of ribs. The kidneys lie in the retroperitoneal space between the peritoneum and posterior wall of the abdomen. Because of the position of the liver, which occupies considerable space on the right side, the right kidney is slightly lower than the left kidney. Each kidney is 10 to 12 centimeters in length in the adult and has a concave medial border called the renal hilum, from which emerges the ureters that carry urine out of the kidneys to the bladder. The renal hilum is also where the blood vessels enter and exit the kidneys, along with lymphatic vessels and nerves. Each kidney is surrounded by 3 protective connective tissue layers, the deepest being the renal capsule, the middle layer is the adipose capsule, and the most superficial is the renal fascia. You mentioned the 3 connective tissues that surround the kidneys. The deepest layer is the renal capsule, which is a smooth, transparent sheet of dense, irregular connective tissue that is continuous with the covering of the ureters. The renal capsule serves as a barrier against trauma and helps to maintain the shape of the kidneys. Surrounding the renal capsule is the adipose capsule, which is a mass of fatty tissue that protects the kidney from trauma and holds it firmly in place within the abdominal cavity. The most superficial layer is the renal fascia, another thin layer of dense irregular connective tissue that anchors the kidney to the surrounding structures and to the abdominal wall. Note that the kidneys themselves have no pain receptors, but the renal capsule does. So it's only when changes in the liver stretch the renal capsule or when there is impingement on the renal capsule or ureters that pain is generated in this area. Here is a brief introduction to the other structures of the urinary system. A ureter, which is approximately 25 centimeters in length, originates from the medial indentation of each kidney hilum and extends to the base of the bladder. The ureters transport urine from the kidneys to the bladder for storage. Also emerging from the renal hilum are the renal artery, the renal vein, and as we mentioned, nerves and lymphatics. From the bladder, the last structure of the urinary system is the urethra, which differs in length between males and females, much shorter and wider in the female compared to the male. And this is the structure that allows urine to leave the body and be excreted. Note that sitting on top of each kidney is an adrenal gland that produces several hormones. One of them actually targets the kidneys, and that is aldosterone. Let's look at the anatomy of the kidneys. A frontal section through the kidney will show 2 distinct regions, the outer cortex and the deeper medulla or medulla. The main function of the cortex is to filter the blood and form urine. The main function of the medulla is to collect and then remove the urine from the kidneys into the ureters. We mentioned that most of the blood is filtered in the renal cortex. Therefore, this area receives about 90% of the kidney perfusion. The filtrate that is formed in the cortex from the blood then passes into the inner portion of the kidney called the medulla. The medulla functions to concentrate and alter the composition of the filtrate. So there's a constant exchange between the blood and the filtrate to alter the composition of filtrate, but ultimately alter the composition of the blood. Whatever remains in the filtrate becomes urine, which is excreted from the kidneys and the body. The medulla is composed of triangular-shaped repeating units called medullary pyramids. The base of the pyramids face the outer cortex, while the apex or tips of the pyramids, which are called the renal papilla, point toward the renal hilum. Note that portions of the renal cortex extend between the renal pyramids and are called renal columns. Let's follow the path of urine flow through the kidneys a little further. The renal papilla, or the tips of the renal pyramids, is a location where the papillary ducts of the medullary pyramids empty filtrate into cup-like structures called minor and major calyces. Now, there are smaller ducts within the kidneys called collecting ducts, which collect filtrate from several of the filtering units, which are called nephrons. The collecting ducts merge to form the papillary ducts, which then drain filtrate out of the medullary pyramids into first minor calyces. Each minor calyx receives urine from the papillary ducts of one renal pyramid. Then the minor calyces drain into the major calyces. Now technically, once the filtrate enters the calyces, it becomes urine because it can no longer be modified. So each kidney has several minor calyces, 8 to 18, which then drain into the 2 or 3 major calyces. Urine collected in the major calyces will then drain into the single large cup called the renal pelvis, which drains urine out of the kidney through the ureter. The hilum or hilus is the medial indentation of the kidney through which the ureter emerges, along with blood vessels, lymphatic vessels, and nerves. The hilum expands into a cavity within the kidney called the renal sinus, which contains part of the renal pelvis, the calyces, and branches of the renal blood vessels and nerves. Adipose tissue helps to stabilize the position of these structures within the renal sinus. Together, the renal cortex and renal pyramids in the medulla constitute the parenchyma or functional part of the kidney. Within the parenchyma are the functional units of the kidneys, the filtering units, which are called nephrons. Each kidney has about 1 million of these microscopic structures. The nephrons filter the blood and form the filtrate. Parts of the nephron also modify the filtrate and then drain the filtrate into collecting ducts, which then drain into papillary ducts, which then drain into the minor calyces, which drain into the major calyces. All the major calyces drain into the single renal pelvis, and then the urine is taken out of the kidneys via the ureter to be stored in the urinary bladder. The ureters are thick-walled muscular tubes that carry urine from the renal pelvis of the kidneys to the urinary bladder. Each ureter is 25 to 30 centimeters in length and varies in diameter from 1 millimeter to 10 millimeters. Like the kidneys, the ureters are retroperitoneal. As the ureters enter the bladder, they enter on the posterior aspect at an oblique angle. Even though there are no anatomical valves at the opening of the ureters into the bladder, this arrangement creates a physiological valve where, as the bladder fills with urine, pressure buildup compresses the oblique openings of the ureters and prevents backflow of urine. The walls of the ureters include a mucosa and muscularis, surrounded by an outer adventitia. The mucosa is lined with transitional epithelium, and the muscularis is 2 layers of smooth muscle in the proximal 2/3 and 3 layers in the distal third. These muscle layers mainly perform peristalsis that moves urine from the kidneys into the bladder. Also supporting the flow of urine is hydrostatic pressure or fluid pressure as urine continuously drains from the kidneys into the ureters, and also assisting is gravity. In this diagram, we can also see the urinary bladder, which is covered on its superior surface by the visceral peritoneum. The wall of the bladder is made up of 3 layers of smooth muscle, collectively called detrusor muscle. At the base, the inner layer of smooth muscle thickens to form the internal urethral sphincter, which is involuntarily controlled and surrounds the internal urethral orifice, or the opening from the bladder into the more distal urethra. Note that a region called the trigone is formed by the 2 ureteral openings posteriorly and the internal urethral orifice anteriorly, and this region essentially acts as a funnel to drain urine out of the bladder. The mucosa of the bladder is lined with transitional epithelium. Note that the bladder collapses when it is empty and is located within the pelvic cavity. As the bladder fills with urine, it becomes more balloon-shaped and extends up into the abdominal cavity. The distension of the bladder is supported not only by transitional epithelium, but the presence of inner folds called rugae that allow for extension of the bladder. The external urethral sphincter, or valve, is formed by the deep muscles of the perineum as the urethra passes through the pelvic floor. So the internal urethral orifice opens into the urethra, which is surrounded by the external urethral sphincter. Again, this is voluntarily controlled to regulate the excretion of urine in a process called micturition. The urethra is a tube that leads from the internal urethral orifice at the base of the bladder to the exterior of the body. In females, the urethra is unique to the urinary system. However, you will recall that in males, the urethra is a passageway for both urine and sperm, and therefore is an organ of both the urinary and reproductive systems. In females, the urethra lies posterior to the pubic symphysis and anterior to the vagina, and is about 4 centimeters in length. The opening of the urethra is the external urethral orifice and is located between the clitoris and the vaginal opening within the vulva. The wall of the urethra consists of mucosa internally and a superficial muscularis. The mucosa has epithelium that changes from transitional epithelium near the bladder, and then eventually becomes non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelium near the external urethral orifice. Between these areas, the mucosa contains stratified columnar or pseudostratified columnar epithelium. The arrangement is similar in males. Now, the urethra in the female is shorter and wider and is closer in proximity to microbes in the vagina and rectum or anal canal. Therefore, females are at a much higher risk of developing urinary tract infections compared to males. In the male, the urethra is much longer at 20 centimeters. And you will recall that it begins at the base of the urinary bladder, where it passes through the prostate gland, forming the prostatic urethra, and then passes through the pelvic floor, where the deep muscles of the perineum surround the urethra and form the external urethral sphincter. This region is called the membranous urethra. And then most of the length of the urethra passes through the penis and ends at the external urethral orifice.